Naomi Klein is here. She is a writer. She is an activist. She has taken on the impact of the global economic system in previous books, No Logo and Shock Doctrine. This book is called This Changes Everything. It is a sweeping take on climate change, which challenges conventional thinking on that topic. She does not think carbon is the main problem, but capitalism as we know it. Time magazine says this may be the first truly honest book ever written about climate change. I'm pleased to have Naomi Klein back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
You said this is the hardest book you've ever had to write?
It was. Anybody who really dives deep into the climate science and just the state of this threat, it's easy to get overwhelmed by the scale of it. And because the book is not just looking at climate science, but looking at this tension between our economic model, which is built to pursue short-term growth, right, and our planetary system, which needs us to contract our use of finite resources, particularly fossil fuels. It was overwhelming, and it became easier to write as there started to be more of a grassroots response, more of a climate movement that emerged. The book came out the same week that those huge protests in New York happened during the UN Climate Summit. So that made it easier to write when I started to see a response. For a few years, it took 5 years to write. The first couple of years, I certainly struggled with just a sense of hopelessness. But that's changed.
Because the problem was so obvious to you and nobody was doing anything about it that would make a difference in the long run.
Well, I mean, the problem is clear. Since our governments have been negotiating to lower emissions, it was a process that began in the early 90s, global emissions have gone up by 61%. And our climate scientists, but also our most establishment institutions like the World Bank, tell us that if we stay on the road we're on, that takes us to 4 to 6 degrees Celsius of warming. That is catastrophic. I mean, we're talking about, at the high end, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. And they describe this as a business as usual. So, I think anybody who really looks hard at these numbers knows that we're in trouble. And the longer we wait, the more that the response challenges our economic system because we need to cut so much and so deeply.
What was the question you asked yourself as you set off to write this book?
Well, I think it came out of, my last book, the last time I talked to you, The Shock Doctrine, was about how we are, the way in which we are responding to disasters, whether economic crises or natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, is increasingly building a highly unequal society, that these crises are harnessed to push through very unpopular, very divisive policies. And so in a way, the question I started with was, how can we prevent climate change from being another opportunity to use the shock doctrine? Because that's how I ended that book. It was New Orleans. It was Hurricane Katrina. It was this glimpse into the future that we are creating as we see more and more heavy weather, and that heavy weather collides with weak infrastructure, very segregated societies, very unequal societies. And when I was covering Katrina, I had this feeling of, this is a glimpse into the future if we don't change our course. So it's not just about the weather getting hotter, it's about building a society that's more brutal.
It is not so much you presenting here new evidence about the threat of climate change. You're asking the question, why have we not responded if we clearly understand the consequences?
Exactly. I mean, in fact, I really wanted to write a book about climate change for people who don't read books about climate change. My previous books have been about our economic system, our labor system, and I've really been struck that there's this issue which affects all of us, which is an existential crisis for humanity. We leave it to this very small segment of environmentalists and say, you deal with it. And really, this is a human rights issue. This is an economic development issue. This is an economic justice issue. And yet, we barely talk about it. And so I wanted to write a book that just was not just about the science. There's actually just a few pages at the beginning that says, okay, this is where we're at. And then ask that question, why have we failed to respond? And I looked at the various, rationales for that inaction that get floated. It's human nature. We think too short term. We hear that a lot. Or we're told that it's because it's too complicated and the UN is, it's too unwieldy an institution. But, testing these various theories, they didn't really hold up for me, because we do know that we human beings, flawed as we are, have responded to other crises with tremendous solidarity and sacrifice. I mean, this is, if we think about the responses to both world wars, or we think about how this country came together in the aftermath of the market crash in 1929. So we have responded to crises before. Why not this one?
Did we come together in response to 9/11, do you think? We're talking about that today in the news.
Well, but I think that that the way in which you had this very decisive government response to 9/11, certainly people did come together. They also came apart. It wasn't monolithic. But there was definitely a sense at the very top, this is a crisis, and we're going to respond as such. It meant a huge marshaling of resources. And what I say at the start of this book is climate change has never truly received the crisis treatment from our leaders. We hear words like, we'll hear John Kerry talk about how climate change is equivalent to weapons of mass destruction, but they're not acting like it. They don't act like it in the way that...
There is no action plan.
Not in this, not in that sense of mobilizing resources. I mean, the amounts that have been marshaled to, for instance, assist developing countries to leapfrog over fossil fuels and respond to climate change are piddly in comparison to, for instance, the amounts of resources that were marshaled to bail out the banks. So, it's not that we know it's a crisis, but I think this is actually why so many people turn away from climate change, because it's so hard to reconcile these very alarming scientific reports that we get from the Intergovernmental...
Are your arguments different, say, than the well-known arguments of Al Gore?
Well, because when I try to answer this question of why haven't we responded, right? I mean, we often hear that it's just, a lack of political will. My diagnosis is quite different.
And it is that it is part of the system, and the economic system, and the same political system that you've been writing about are themes of earlier books.
Yes, and I think that having done that research earlier sort of definitely informed, when I turned my attention to climate change, how I saw the unfolding of events. Because the central argument of the book is that the reason why we haven't responded is because climate change struck us at the worst possible moment in human history, and that moment was the late 1980s, that this crisis has suffered from a case of epic bad timing. So this...
late 1980s was bad timing because?
So late 1980s was the moment when we lost all plausible deniability. This is the moment when James Hansen testifies on Capitol Hill. Okay. So this is the moment...
There was a...
Yeah, it's when there
was a canary in the mine.
But it's also when governments first began negotiating to lower emissions. It was the year of the first intergovernmental panel, the first intergovernmental conference on climate change, and it was the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed, the scientific body. So what else was happening in 1988? Well, it was the year before the Berlin Wall collapsed. It was this triumphant moment for what Joseph Stiglitz has called market fundamentalism, this idea that we need to remove all boundaries to multinational corporations, crack the world market wide open. Deregulation was...
1988 was the second term of the Reagan administration. Reagan ran first in 1980, and then he ran again in 84. So it was the end of the Reagan administration and the beginning of George Bush 41 first.
But also a lot of this happened under Clinton.
Clinton came in 92.
Yeah, and so this has definitely been bipartisan in terms of the response, because...
Or lack of response.
Or lack of response. And so here we have this collective crisis that requires collective action. It crosses all borders. It requires cooperation. And it hits us at this moment when we're being told that there's really something wrong with collective action and something wrong with regulating corporations. So the way in which we should have responded, which is by regulating polluters, putting strict rules in place, and having them be legally binding, was just sort of unthinkable in this moment.
Would cap and trade have been, if it had passed in the beginning of the Obama administration, how would you have characterized that? As a weak response or as a good step forward?
Well, I think it would have been a profoundly inadequate response. And we know this because the European Union went down that road. The European Union did pass legislation that introduced emission trading. They created a market in carbon rather than have strict regulations and penalties. And it became a bubble, and it became a boondoggle. It attracted a huge amount of fraud. So I think cap and trade was not the right way to respond to climate change.
And would a carbon tax be the right way?
It's certainly a more direct way. It depends how high the tax is. It depends how fairly it's implemented. Because I think part of why people turn away from this crisis is because there is this sense, and we hear this sort of messaging from Republicans all the time, that this is just about your bills going up, your utility bills going up, higher prices at the pump. And there's this sense of real injustice. I mean, people are under a huge amount of economic stress. And the model that has been proposed has mainly passed the bill on to consumers as opposed to gone after polluters on a polluter pays model. So, for instance, increasing royalty rates for fossil fuel extraction and making sure that it was actually the oil and gas and coal companies that paid the price and not consumers. So I think a tax would have been more direct, but it has to be a progressive carbon tax because people are under tremendous economic stress. And if you do think about moments where people have come together, I mentioned, the Second World War, for instance, it was enormously important that people felt that that everybody was being asked to sacrifice, that it wasn't just the poor, that even the very rich, even celebrities had to make do with less. And you think about something like the California drought, right? People are told, take shorter showers, but then they look at the golf courses, they look at the private swimming pools, and they say, wait a minute, something doesn't add up, or fracking, which takes a huge amount of water. And this has been the political truism since Carter's infamous speech where he said, we're all going to have to wear sweaters, and ever since, you haven't had politicians who have been willing to say, okay, there are going to have to be sacrifices. But it's interesting because I talk about that speech, that infamous speech in the book, and it's interesting because actually his numbers didn't go down immediately. People liked the speech at first, and then there was this campaign against it. But I quote Christopher Latch, who is one of the people who advised the president on that speech, and he said, Carter didn't take my advice. He didn't take my entire advice because I told him if he wants to ask Americans to sacrifice, he has to say that it'd be a system that is just, and that this isn't going to just be passed on to the poorest people, that the people who are most responsible are going to also have to sacrifice. And that was missing from the speech, and that's why it has to be.
To do that?
Well, this comes down to a very old story about the fact that it is, it's hard to take on the most powerful forces in society. I mean, certainly if we're talking about fossil fuel companies, we're talking about the richest companies in the history of money. ExxonMobil made $45 billion in a single year. That's more than any company has ever made. So, it's easier to ask individuals to take shorter showers and put on sweaters than it is to try to gain control over a company that can run attack ads against you, that can make your life really hard. And so it's been this theory of the low-hanging fruit. Let's go after the easy stuff. And the easy stuff actually is passing on the bill to the people who can least afford to pay and letting those powerful forces off the hook. And I think that's what has to change, and that is changing. And they pass it on to them in what way? Through higher costs, through
Okay.
But I think even more than that, even more than those economic stresses, is a real sense that inequality is out of control. And
there is a sense of that, clearly.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sense of that even among people whose solution to inequality you wouldn't particularly like. There is a sense it's out of control.
Yeah.
On the right and the left.
There is.
The difference is what's the answer to somehow eliminating it.
So the argument I'm making in the book is that if we respond to climate change through a justice lens, what's called climate justice, then we actually have a chance to tackle inequality and climate change at the same time. And that, to me, I mean, if there is this sort of there's this logjam when it comes to responding to this crisis, and that has to do with the fact that you have on one side of the issue forces with a tremendous amount to lose if we get serious about climate change. I mean, we need to be cutting our emissions so quickly that it actually represents a threat to the business model of the fossil fuel sector, which always needs to have as much in reserve as it has in production. So they're very afraid of climate talks like the ones going.
And force them to make alternative decisions.
So they fight like they mean it. They fight like they mean it. They fight hard against climate progress. And we've seen a series of reports. The New York Times had an incredible investigation recently about how attorneys general at the state level are working very, very closely with energy companies and basically, acting as their lobbyists, sending letters to the EPA, sending letters to the president, complaining about regulations that were written by coal companies and oil and gas companies, and just putting it on their letterhead. I mean, this is what this latest set of documents has revealed. So they're fighting really hard. And on the other side of this issue, you have a lot of liberals who sort of care about climate change, but not that much. I think what's starting to happen is that a climate movement is emerging that is made up of communities that are directly impacted by fossil fuel extraction and combustion. So it's people who have refineries in their backyards, whose kids have very high rates of asthma, who are concerned about their water, if there's fracking in their communities. So it's a very different kind of climate movement. It's not a movement of sort of slick NGOs. It's a movement of impacted communities. And that, I think, can tip the balance.
If you're looking for a perfect model or a good model where they have made the effort in climate change, a country, how have they done it?
Well, the model that seems to work in terms of rolling out renewable energy very quickly, we can see in Germany, and we can also see it in Denmark, which is what's called a feed-in tariff that encourages communities to switch to renewable energy because they're able to feed into the grid, and if they produce more energy than they need, then they actually benefit economically from that. It pays back to them. And so the reason why this has been really, really popular in Europe right now is Europe, as you know, is dealing with economic crises, austerity. So what's worked is our policies that don't just bring clean energy, because people do want clean energy, but they also want money to pay for services. They want money to pay for schools and libraries and all of that. So the German recipe has encouraged hundreds of cities and towns to take back control over their energy grids and keep those profits within their communities to pay for other services. So now Germany has 25% of its electricity coming from renewable energy, much of it wind and solar, much of it decentralized. There's 900 new energy cooperatives. So that model works. It works.
No nuclear?
Well, they're switching. They're moving away from nuclear. The flip side of that is that Germany has not done a good enough job of saying no to its very powerful coal lobby. So it's not just enough to put these good incentives in place to encourage renewable energy. What Germany shows us is that if you put those incentives in place, you can move really quickly. This has happened over a decade and a half. And if you compare that number, that 25% number, to the U.S., in the U.S. that number's at around 4%. So that's really impressive. And I think it's important for Americans to look to, a highly industrialized economy like Germany, a very powerful economy, and say, okay, look, if they can do it, and it's a dark country, doesn't have nearly as good conditions for renewable energy as the United States does, then this could happen in the United States. There's research out of Stanford that says we can get to 100% renewable energy in the United States by 2030. The technology is there. But what Germany also shows is you have to say no to the fossil fuel companies at the same time as you say yes to renewable energy, because in Germany they're continuing to dig up very dirty coal, lignite coal, which is sometimes called brown coal. And as demand drops in Germany, they're able to export it. And this is also happening in the U.S.
Well, what's happening in China, where they have a known pollution problem of a significant impact. Yeah. And at the same time, they're saying to many in the world community, you had a chance to march into industrialization, and we need to do that now. Mm-hmm. At the same time, because of their own economic wealth, it seems to me, are making a significant investment into looking for alternatives. But right now, they're building coal plants.
Well, they're building both, and it's quite extraordinary. We made a documentary film to go with this book that comes out in a couple of months. And I think the most powerful image in the film is this image of just a sea of solar panels, the likes of which you would never see in this country, and it just seems to go on forever. But it's coated that the sky is filled with so much smog that the sun can barely pierce through the smog to get through to the solar panels. So this is the contradiction of China. Yes, on the one hand, they're rolling out renewable energy very, very rapidly. China spent more on renewable energy last year than the European Union combined. But because it is such a large economy, such a fast-growing economy, they're going down these two roads simultaneously, and one cancels the other out. So what gives me hope about what's happening in China is that the Chinese government is facing enormous pressure from below, from political movements in China. I mean, despite the fact that it's not a democracy,
social tension between urban and rural.
But you know what? For a long time, there has been this social tension between urban and rural, where it's really been the countryside that has paid the price for prosperity in the cities. The difference with air pollution is that it affects even the winners, or even it affects especially the winners in the cities, right? So there's always been the sense of, okay, we can sacrifice the countryside for the city. There will be losers, but there'll be these winners. But now the winners are afraid to let their kids go to school without pollution masks. They're afraid to let their kids play outside because pollution levels are so high. And so that's really what's creating a crisis for the Chinese government, is that even the winners are saying, hold on a minute, this system of just uncontrolled economic growth, the price is too high. So that pushback, that tension is creating a situation where we can no longer just point the finger at China and say, well, what does it matter what we do? China's just opening a coal plant, a week or a month. That's, China is changing, and they're also closing a lot of coal plants. And there are things that we can do.
So you're optimistic about what they're doing to cure their own problems.
I think that we need to look at that. We need to stop scapegoating China, and we need to think, okay, so there are these two tensions, and there are these two streams in this country. There are the people who just want to open more and more cheap coal-fired plants, and there is this growing grassroots movement of people who want clean energy. There are things that happen in this country and in other wealthy countries that affect which side of that debate is going to win, is going to carry the day. The more we shirk our own responsibilities in wealthy countries, in the countries that have been burning fossil fuels for a couple of hundred years and clearly have a greater responsibility, when we don't lead, when we don't live up to our responsibility, then that strengthens the hand of the forces in China that just say, well, it's our turn now, right? If we want to strengthen the hand of the forces in China that are saying, we want to leapfrog over fossil fuels, the price is too high, then we need to transition ourselves, because that makes their argument stronger. So
what do you make of this new deal between China and the United States signed? The president was in China.
Well, look, we're in a really critical time for climate negotiations. There's after these talks in Lima, the next negotiation in Paris has to produce a deal. And it's important that going into this process, the U.S. and China are not pointing fingers at each other, but are shaking hands and saying, we're cooperating. That's a big difference from what happened the last time there was a big high-stakes climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009, which ended with the U.S. and China accusing each other of being the reason the whole thing collapsed. So from a scientific perspective, it's not enough. The emission reductions in that deal keep us on a road to 4 to 6 degrees warming. But from a political perspective, I think it creates a framework where progress is possible, but that's only going to be possible if there's a much stronger push from below in both countries and around the world.
If you were going to change the American economic system, would you, for the most part, eliminate the impact of money on politics? Mm-hmm. Or would you do something having to do with the fundamental structure of our economic and political system?
Well, I think it's a bit of a chicken and an egg thing, because the argument about getting money out of politics is that needs to happen before any of those structural changes can take place. And I think that, we saw that so dramatically after the financial collapse in 2008, where it was so clear that there needed to be a strong re-regulation of the banking sector, and not nearly enough happened because of the political influence of money in politics and the ability of the banking sector to block regulation. That's happening in the context of climate change, with the fossil fuel companies blocking systematically the kind of regulations that we need. So I think we need to do it before we can get the structural changes that are necessary, before we can get those bold policies that will.
Suppose you could do that, and what would be the structural changes?
Well, I think the reason why I talk about bad timing is that we are not going to do what we need to do to respond to this crisis unless we're willing to talk about the failures of the ideology, of that market fundamentalist ideology in delivering the types of policies we need. We do need to regulate polluters. We cannot pass the bill for this crisis on to working people. We have to ask the polluters. We have to demand that the polluters pay. So we need those types of policies. We need to be closing off new fossil fuel frontiers. It is madness that in this moment, when we need to be radically reducing our emissions, we're opening up whole new fossil fuel frontiers, whether in the Arctic, whether it's fracking, new territories for fracking, whether it's the Alberta tar sands and building new pipelines. So one of the things we need to do
shale oil is not a savior.
It's a fossil fuel. We need to get off fossil fuels. So, when you're in a hole, one of the things you have to do is stop digging. So we have to stop making things worse, and we need to roll out the policies to make things better. And fundamentally, we need to get over the idea that planning our economies is a dirty word. We aren't going to do this without real planning. And that means deciding the types of industries that we want to encourage, and actively discouraging the ones that we don't. And I do think that at this late stage in the crisis, we have to talk about consumption. Many people in this world have a right to consume more, but there are many people in this world who are consuming way too much. So I don't think that our current levels of out of control consumption in this country and in other industrialized countries, in China as well, are in any way sustainable with what we need to do to tackle this crisis. And we have to start being honest about that.
Thank you for coming. It's good to see you as always.
You too.
The book is called This Changes Everything, Naomi Klein. The subtitle is Capitalism versus the Climate. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.